Ishmael Chapter 1, Section 4. I was thunderstruck, as you may well imagine. Not Goliath? What could it possibly mean to be not Goliath? It didn't occur to me to say, well, if I'm not Goliath, then who am I? A human would ask this question because he would know that, whatever his name, he is assuredly someone. I did not. On the contrary, it seemed to me that if I was not Goliath, then I must be no one at all. Though this stranger had never laid eyes on me before that day, I didn't doubt for a moment that he spoke with an unquestionable authority. 1,000 others had called me by the name of Goliath, even those who, like the workers at the menagerie, knew me well. But that was clearly not the point. It counted for nothing. The stranger hadn't said, "Your name is not Goliath." He had said, "You are not Goliath." There was a world of difference. As I felt it, though I could not have expressed it in this way at the time, my awareness of selfhood had been pronounced a delusion. I drifted into a sort of fugue state, neither aware nor unconscious. An attendant came around with food, but I ignored him. Night fell, but I didn't sleep. The rain stopped and the sun rose without my noticing. Soon there were the usual crowds of visitors calling out, "Goliath, Goliath, Goliath," but I paid no attention. Several days passed in this way. Then one evening, after the menagerie had closed for the day, I took a long drink from my bowl and soon fell asleep. A powerful sedative had been added to my water. At dawn, I awoke in an unfamiliar cage. At first, because it was so large and so strangely shaped, I didn't even recognize it as a cage. In fact, it was circular and open to the air on all sides. As I later understood, a gazebo had been modified to serve the purpose. Except for a large white house nearby, it stood alone in the midst of an attractive park that I imagine must extend to the ends of the earth. It was not long before I'd conceived an explanation for this strange translocation. The people who visited the menagerie came, at least in part, with the expectation of seeing a gorilla named Goliath. How they came to have this expectation, I could not guess. But they certainly seemed to have it. And when the owner of the menagerie learned that I was, in fact, not Goliath, he could scarcely go on exhibiting me as such, and so had no real choice but to send me away. I didn't know whether to be sorry about this or not. My new home was far more pleasant than anything I'd seen since leaving Africa. But without the daily stimulation of the crowds, it would soon become even more excruciatingly boring than the zoo, where at least I'd had the company of other gorillas. I was still pondering these matters when, around mid-morning, I looked up and saw that I was not alone. A man was standing just beyond the bars, blackly silhouetted against the sunlit house in the distance. I approached cautiously and was astonished to recognize him. As if reenacting our former encounter, we gazed into each other's eyes for several minutes. I sitting on the floor of my cage, he leaning on his walking stick. I saw that, dry and freshly dressed, he was not the elderly person I'd first taken him for. His face was long and dark and bony, his eyes burned with a strange intensity, and his mouth seemed set in an expression of bitter mirth. At last he nodded, exactly as before, and said, "Yes, I was right. You are not Goliath. You are Ishmael." Once again, as if everything that mattered was now finally settled, he turned and walked away. And once again I was thunderstruck, but this time by a feeling of profound relief, for I had been redeemed from oblivion. More, the error that caused me to live as an unwitting impostor for so many years had been corrected at last. I had been made whole as a person, not again, but for the very first time. I was consumed with curiosity about my Savior. I didn't think to associate him with my removal from the menagerie to this charming belvedere, for I was as yet incapable of even that most primitive of fallacies, post hoc ergo propter hoc. He was to me a supernal being, to a mind ready for mythology. He was the beginning of what is meant to be godlike. He had twice made a brief appearance in my life, and twice, with a single utterance, had transformed me. I tried to search for the underlying meaning of these appearances, but found only questions. Had this man come to the menagerie in search of Goliath or in search of me? Had he become? Had he come because he hoped I was Goliath, or because he suspected I was not Goliath? How had he so promptly found me in my new location? I had no measure to the extent of human information. If it was common knowledge that I could be found at the menagerie, as it had seemed to be so, what was it also common knowledge that I could now be found here? Despite all these unanswerable questions, the overwhelming fact remained that this uncanny creature had twice sought me out in order to address me in an unprecedented way, as a person. I was certain that, having finally settled the matter of my identity, he would vanish from my life forever. What more was there for him to do? Doubtless you will have surmised that all these breathless apperceptions were just so much moonshine. Nonetheless, the truth, as I later learned it, was not much less fantastic. My benefactor was a wealthy Jewish merchant of this city, a man by the name of Walter Sokolow. On the day he discovered me at the menagerie, he had been out walking in the rain in a kind of suicidal gloom that had descended on him a few months before, when he learned beyond any doubt that his entire family had been swallowed up in the Nazi Holocaust. His wanderings led him to the carnival set up at the edge of town, and he went in with nothing in particular on his mind. Because of the rain, most of the booths and rides were shut down, giving the place an air of abandonment that accorded well with his melancholy. At last he came to the menagerie, whose chief attractions were advertised in a series of lurid paintings. One of these, more lurid than the rest, depicted a gorilla, Goliath, brandishing a broken body of an African native as if it were a weapon. Walter Sokolow, perhaps thinking that the gorilla named Goliath was an apt symbol for the Nazi giant that was then engaged in crushing the race of David, decided it would be satisfying to behold such a monster behind bars. He went in, approached my wagon, and by gazing into my eyes soon realized that I was no relation to the bloodthirsty monster on the painting, and indeed no relation to the Philistine tormentor of his race. He found it gave him no satisfaction whatever to see me behind bars. On the contrary, a quixotic gesture of guilt and defiance, he decided to rescue me from my cage and fashion me into a dreadful substitute for the family he had failed to rescue from the cage of Europe. The owner of the menagerie was agreeable to the sale. He was even glad to let Mr. Sokolow hire away a handler who had looked after me since my arrival. The owner was a realist. With America's inevitable entrance into the war, traveling shows like his were either going to spend the duration of the in winter quarters, or simply become extinct. After letting me settle in for a few days in my new surroundings, Mr. Sokolow returned to begin to make my acquaintance. He wanted the handler to show him how everything was done, from mixing my feed to cleaning my cage. He asked him if he thought I was dangerous. The handler said that I was like a piece of heavy machinery, dangerous not by disposition, but by dint and sheer size and power. After an hour or so, Mr. Sokolow sent him away, and we gazed at each other in a long silence, as we had already done twice before. Finally, reluctantly, as if surmounting some daunting interior barrier, he began to speak to me, not in the jocular way of visitors to the menagerie, but rather as one speaks to the wind or the waves crashing at the beach, uttering that which must be said, but which must not be heard by anyone. As he poured out his sorrows and self-recriminations, he gradually forgot the need for caution. By the time an hour had passed, he was propped up against my cage with a hand wrapped around the bar. He was looking at the ground, lost in thought, and I used this opportunity to express my sympathy, reaching out and gently stroking the knuckles of his hand. He leaped back, startled and horrified, but a search of my eyes reassured him that my gesture was as innocent of menace as it seemed. Alerted by this experience, he began to suspect that I possessed real intelligence, and a few simple tests were enough to convince him of this. Having proved that I understood his words, he leaped to the conclusion, as others were later to do in working with other primates, that I should be able to produce some of my own. In short, he decided to teach me how to talk. I will pass over the painful and humiliating months that followed. Neither one of us understood that the difficulty was unsurmountable. Owing to the lack of basic phonic equipment on my part, in the absence of that understanding, we both labored on and under the impression that the knack would someday magically manifest itself in me if we persevered. But at last, there came a day when I couldn't go on, and in my anguish at not being able to tell him this, I thought him this. With all my mental power I possessed, he was stunned, as I was when I saw that he'd heard my mental cry. I won't burden you with all the steps of our progress once full communication was established between us, since they are easily imagined, I believe. Over the next decade, he taught me all he knew of the world and the universe of human history. And when my questions went beyond his knowledge, we studied side by side. And when my studies carried me beyond his own interests at last, he cheerfully became my research assistant, tracking down books and information in places that were, of course, beyond my reach. With the new interest of my education to absorb his attention, my benefactor soon forgot to torment himself with remorse and so gradually recovered from his gloom. By the early 60s, I was like a house guest who needed very little attention from his host. So Mr. Sokolow began to allow himself to be rediscovered in social circles, with the not unpredictable result that he soon found himself in the hands of a young woman of 40 who saw no reason why he could not be made into a satisfactory sort of husband. In fact, he was not at all averse to marriage, but he made a terrible mistake in anticipation of it. He decided that our special relationship should be kept a secret from his wife. It was not an extraordinary decision for those times, and I was not sufficiently experienced in such matters to recognize it for the error it was. I moved back into the gazebo as soon as it had been renovated to accommodate the civilized habits I'd acquired. From the first, however, Mrs. Sokolow viewed me as a peculiar and alarming pet and began agitating for my speedy removal or disposal. Luckily, my benefactor was used to having his own way and made it clear that no amount of pleading or coercion would change the situation he'd created for me. A few months after the wedding, he dropped in to tell me that his wife, like Abraham's Sarah, was going to present him with a child of his old age. I anticipated nothing like this when I named you Ishmael, he told me, but rest assured that I won't let her cast you out of my house the way Sarah cast your namesake out of Abraham's house. Nevertheless, it amused him to say that if it was a boy, he would name him Isaac. As matters turned out, however, it was a girl, and they named her Rachel.